Hi, this is Mary Kay's Positivity Podcast. I'm a yoga and meditation teacher and life coach. I'm also author of several self-help books. Today I have Dr. Caitlyn McClure, who started her journey as an undergraduate social work student with a focus on addiction. She received a master's in social work with focus on trauma specialization and clinical concentration, and a PhD in social work. Caitlyn has grown to understand the relationship between addiction and trauma, and as clinical director at Northern Illinois Recovery, she also has experience working with bereavement, trauma, mental health, and substance abuse. So thank you, Caitlyn, for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Since the holidays are coming up soon, the day before Thanksgiving is wildly known as Blackout Wednesday, and it's the busiest night for bars all year, and yet sober, curious movements are gaining momentum. Why?
I think that people are starting to realize that alcohol consumption, especially in our American culture, has been glorified, and the real impacts and the consequences for people, even if they don't identify as problem drinkers, is pretty substantial. And the reality is that we as a culture have begun to use alcohol to celebrate good things, to grieve bad things, and really everything in between. And people are finding themselves shackled to alcohol for all of their life's happenings. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's where the sober curious movement's really coming into play, is saying there's got to be a different way to move through my life than feeling like I have to include alcohol in every part of it.
We're growing up, I remember college, people drank and had fun, but it was never like, I don't remember the night, or black was definitely not cool. Like if you blacked out, you didn't tell anybody, it was bad news. And now it seems like it's an accepted part of the culture and celebrated. Why did it change?
Yeah, I think that binge drinking in some ways became this badge of honor for like functional alcoholism. So I think that there was this sense before that if you were a blackout drinker or you were a binge drinker, that was probably reflective of your day-to-day, and it probably meant that you couldn't hold a job and couldn't maintain relationships and couldn't be successful in life. And so I think there's this movement of we can have both things. We can have the American dream, and we can do this and engage in this behavior, and both are possible, because if I limit my drinking to weekends and I binge drink, it quote unquote doesn't affect these other areas of my life in the ways that people traditionally think of when they think of alcoholism. And I think it was a way to skirt the norms and the rules around what was acceptable and what we could tolerate as a culture.
Mm-hmm. Well, what about drinking just on the weekend? How does that affect your mental health?
Yeah, we've got a lot of really interesting research that's been coming out about the impacts of drinking, even in these different types of, if you want to call it moderated behavior, moderated scheduling of drinking. Mm-hmm. And the reality is you have these huge impacts on your sleep cycles, on your immune system from these episodes of drinking, even when it's binge drinking on a weekend. Mm-hmm. That takes this long period to recover and kind of recalibrate. And so you find that by the time you're recalibrating and getting to a healthy place, it starts all over again, because that binge drinking for the next weekend occurs. Mm-hmm. And I think that what we know is when you throw off your sleep, when you're feeling ill and under the weather and all of that, you're also going to start experiencing these mood impacts, right? Of depression, even anxiety around like, how am I going to manage, right? Because if I drink away my weekend and then it's back to work on Monday, there starts to be this overload of things that are waiting for me and looming for me that I didn't get to, I didn't tackle. And you find that this pattern, this routine starts to become a vicious cycle that's hard to escape, because I start to then drink to manage my depressed mood or my anxiety or my isolation, and it spirals really quickly.
Mm-hmm. What are some unknown signs that someone is drinking too much?
I think that we always talk about the really obvious things, right? And that's where functional alcoholism came in, this idea that I could have all the things at one time. I think what you start to notice is people planning their activities around alcohol, and it's about, where are we going out this weekend? What are we going to drink? This fixation on these cultural things. So happy hours were the traditional way that we built in alcohol as a norm of, 4 to 6, everybody's at the bar drinking after work. And then we've built in all these drink specials and margarita Tuesdays with tacos and all these, again, cultural norms of, of course, every girls' night has everybody's bringing wine or that kind of thing.
Right.
And so I think what you start to notice is when that shift becomes the focus and that becomes the center of the conversation around event planning and time management. And I think really part of it too is, and I come from a family of some functional alcoholism, and reflecting on it as an adult, I go, man, you know that it's problematic when you can't go to a family gathering and not have a drink without somebody, especially as a woman, without someone thinking that, the only reason she wouldn't be drinking is because she's pregnant. Right. And so these situations that we're in of like, wow, upon reflection, that tells me a lot about culture when the norm is always alcohol. And the idea of being like, what if we checked out a local sober bar instead? If somebody has a reaction to that, I think that could be pretty telling as well of proposed activities that don't center around drinking.
Yeah. I always notice, because I don't drink much, and when I'm out, people are sometimes visibly uncomfortable, like, why aren't you drinking, or have a drink? And I'm thinking, I'm still fun without the drink. There is this pressure from some people, and they just seem to really notice who in the room isn't drinking.
Yeah, and I think that's a great microscope, if you will, to understand other people's needs and behaviors, because when you think about it, if I'm trying to make sure that I'm still functioning normally like everybody else, and then everybody else isn't drinking, and I find that I'm starting to have cravings to drink, that means something really scary for me, because that means that I might truly have a problem with alcohol. Right. And so I need to know that everybody else is drinking, and it's not just me having cravings, it's just normal. And so I think we're constantly comparing ourselves to understand what's acceptable. And this is where things get tricky, even between men's and women's drinking patterns, where you'll have women who feel the need to drink to match their male peers or counterparts. And obviously the body is so different, the metabolism is so different, that we know that what's considered above the legal limit for a woman versus a man, the number is the same. The amount of drinks to get there is different. Right. But that comparison happens, and I think that's what, especially in the holidays, you've got all these company gatherings and parties, and so there's this sense of I've got to keep on par to be normal in this current culture I'm in.
How is mental health affected by drinking during the holidays?
Oh man, it's one of those chicken or the egg things during the holidays, because I think there's a lot of people who experience a spike in mental health symptoms during the holidays for so many reasons, right? I think an obvious one that we talk a lot about, especially being in the Midwest where I'm from, is seasonal affective disorder, right? People who, as the time change happens, as we're experiencing this darkness and the cold weather and all that, there's people who have a legitimate impact to their mental health because of those conditions changing. But then there's all the circumstantial stuff, right? So the folks who are coming home from college and are maybe in the midst of this transition and are returning home and still aren't sure who they are and what they want to be, and then they're back in this environment of their old life and they're not sure where that fits in. And so there's this discomfort with negotiating that, and even coming home and maybe not having a room anymore, having gotten moved out, and so feeling like a guest in your own home, easily feeling kind of isolated and disconnected from all these different relationships, because your home friends you haven't talked to maybe in a long time, and maybe you've separated from on purpose. Your college friends are far away, and so there's a lot of isolation for, I think, college students returning home during the holidays. There's a lot of interesting family dynamics that come out around who's spending time with who will be visiting, and the negotiation of time and resources with that. And that can cause a lot of stress for people, a lot of anxiety. And then the other piece is like loss. There's a lot of people who have experienced grief maybe throughout the year, or the holidays specifically were just a really impactful time with someone that they've lost. And so all that memory is coming up. And so you've got just like this host of situations that's triggering an onslaught of mental health struggles and symptoms. And then on top of that, you've got people who are drinking in excess. So the data that they have about just like these self-report surveys says that during the holiday times, the winter holiday months, people are reporting a huge spike in drinking, sometimes double what they normally would drink. And when you add in that layer, and some of the things that come with it. We know that there's a lot of risky decisions that can come with excess alcohol intake, right? The increase in motor vehicle accidents and legal impacts, and even just lowered inhibitions and complicated relationships that might occur. It's just this layer on top of layer on top of layer in this season that can be really challenging if your main coping skill and what's considered normal is just to drink through that, right? Drink through it.
Right.
And so I think that's where it gets really messy, is that we know that there's a lot of mental health stuff that can trigger an increase in drinking to manage. And then also the increase in drinking can trigger additional mental health stuff. And so it just compounds until there's this release valve of some kind.
So how can you get someone you love to stop drinking?
Oh, that is a tale as old as time. So many loved ones, that's what the question they want answered was like, what can I do? And I think what I've learned as a professional, as a person, is it's being willing to have the honest conversation, but know that you're not in control of someone else's choices, because we have to create that freedom for ourselves. That as much as I love you, as much as I see maybe the writing on the wall, I can't force you to see it too. But if I continue to show up, and I think we've made a lot of changes, we used to operate a lot out of this tough love place of, if you don't behave, if you don't shape up, I'm going to cut off our relationship, I'm going to threaten our connection. And I think we know a lot more now about how damaging that is. There's so much isolation and addiction, so much shame and secrecy, and that kind of interaction doesn't improve the situation. And so it's really about that continued openness in relationship. It's so important of, hey, whoever you are, I care about you so much. I'm starting to notice some things that seem off to me and don't fit what I've seen you to be before. And I wanted to bring those to you because I care about you and I'm concerned. And it's not the ultimatum of, and if you don't change your behavior, we can't speak anymore. But that might be a boundary I set for myself. I might say, hey, if all we're going to do is hang out in bars every night until 2 a.m., I can't go out with you anymore because that's not good for me.
Right.
And it's not that I'm going to make you change your behavior, though that might be an impact to you. At that point, I'm focused on my inner protections. And so we talk a lot about the difference between boundaries and ultimatums. And a boundary is me setting something for myself, and you can continue to do whatever you choose to do. And my expectation is only that I'm changing things for me, versus an ultimatum where I'm trying to leverage something to make you change. And we know that is often not as impactful or effective or healthy and supportive as it could be for people struggling.
Yeah. Does a family intervention work? I mean, are they effective at all?
I think they can be really successful. We have seen many folks who that is the impetus that gets them into treatment. I think there always has to be this moment where the motivation shifts from external to internal for anything real to take hold. And so I think what happens is in those family interventions, if everyone comes together and says, hey, we love you and we're so concerned because this is what we've noticed has changed for you. Do you see what we see? That might be the first time the mirror gets held up to that person. And that might be the reason that intervention is impactful, is because they're seeing something. And of course they're going to be defensive and probably a little resistant, because imagine being put in a room with all the people who love you and them saying, hey, we see bad things on your horizon. And so that might not take hold, that impact might not happen immediately. But I think it's that balance of that honest conversation, and maybe there are some family boundaries that need to be set. Hey, you can't be using in my home. You can't do this. And if you do, I will have to make a decision that you can't stay here. And so again, that reinforcing of, I care about you. I'm seeing this. I have these boundaries, rather than us coming together and all saying, if you don't change, we're going to cut you off from the family and you're going to be on your own. That might be what kind of transpires should that person not adhere to the boundaries being set. But the intention is not to cut you off. The goal is not to do that. The goal is to support you. But I do have to protect my well-being too. And I think that's the difference. So I think they can be really effective when done well.
Right. Talk about the loneliness epidemic, especially in recovery. And why is community so vital?
Yeah. Oh my goodness. I think we all know that COVID has had a huge impact on our world, and we continue to see the ripple effects, right? One of the things that is really huge in recovery is somebody's sober support network, the recovery network. This might come through formal means, recovery communities that meet regularly. It might be informal, but what happened for a lot of people in that time was they lost their fellowship of people who got it.
Mm-hmm.
And so they were isolating, they were in their homes with maybe family who didn't understand, with stressors that they didn't know how to manage, because none of us did. And
Mm-hmm.
they turned back to things. We saw folks who had been sober for over a decade who in COVID relapsed and returned to alcohol use because they had lost this critical element of the recovery community. And so I think when you talk about loneliness, that was something that brought the conversation online. I think COVID drew attention to the loneliness epidemic, but I think it was already ongoing before COVID. And I think that the world that we live in pretends that it is connected in so many ways all of the time because of our devices, because of our technologies, our media. It makes us feel like I'm constantly engaged with people, so I'm connected and I can't be lonely. But I think that culture had already started to turn that tide into this superficial connection.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think COVID really just brought the stark contrast out for us where we said, wow, now I'm forcibly only able to interact this way. And it is lonely and it doesn't feel connective. And so like I said, our recovery communities lost a lot of fellowship opportunity during COVID. They talk about how you could get on a meeting, right? You could get on an AA meeting and Zoom, and that was a gift that COVID gave us, was all this stuff being available, but you didn't have the same kind of fellowship. You were just one more square on the screen in the Zoom room. And it was very isolating because people didn't know. In a real life setting, you can look at somebody and say, hey, you don't look okay. Are you okay?
Yeah.
And on Zoom, you were like, well, maybe it's their lighting, maybe they're tired. And so people wouldn't reach out in the same ways.
Right.
And so that was really difficult for people. And I think what we continue to see overall is we've improved our conversations about mental health drastically. And I'm so grateful for that. But we still continue to look at substance use as an impact around character and morality and willpower. And the damage that does is it drives people into the secrecy and loneliness of shame. Mm-hmm. And if you see my disease of addiction as something that's my fault and something that I could do better at, but I'm choosing not to, now I don't want to tell you that I'm struggling because you see that as a sign that I am the problem and I am weak and I am whatever else. And so I see a lot of people who struggle to share that they're struggling with people, to get honest about returning to use, that kind of stuff, because they feel like they're wearing the scarlet A in community. Right. And so that loneliness epidemic is driven in this community by this continued communal shaming around addiction, because we shifted to this idea of a disease model a very long time ago, but we still operate as if it is what it was originally, which is like a character and morality impact.
What are other ways they can lift their spirit, or we can help lift their spirits?
Yeah, I think the fact that we're asking that question is like the profound answer is the fact that people are thinking about these folks and that they recognize that they're struggling with what they're struggling with is the first step. And so I think being an open door to people in your life, being a person who is willing to have the conversations, who is willing to help people get help, because sometimes it's outside of our scope as a friend, but saying, hey, I can help you get connected with some resources. I can help you Google treatment centers or meetings in the area, and I know that these resources exist. And so I think a big part is being a member of a community who recognizes there are people who are struggling, who are not actively telling people that they're struggling, and that there are resources in those communities that if you're not looking for them, you don't know they're there, and it's by design, right? There are these anonymous meetings because they're trying to maintain some sense of confidentiality and privacy for folks who, again, have a disease that is looked down upon in society, that they're not out in the open. They're not having public meetings in the same kinds of ways as maybe like a mental health rally, because to show up at one of those says something about who you are. And so I think as your standard layperson in the community who maybe doesn't struggle with this, being open and having open conversations is huge, right? Of being able to say, yeah, I'm experimenting with dry January, and I'm going to tell people about it, right? Because I want to find other people who are exploring that. I want to find other people who are doing that and starting to turn the tides. I think it's really impactful. One of the great things social media gives us is the ability to get like a peephole into other people's worlds. You start dabbling with the algorithms that be, and you can find some really interesting perspectives from people who are in their own recovery that can be really eye-opening for a person who's just not accustomed to thinking through those struggles or those issues that way. Mm-hmm. And so I think being informed is the best help, and then being an open person to others that they can talk to and feel non-judgment from is huge.
I do think you hit on something that's so important. Being on these Zoom calls, when the energy when you're face to face with someone, or even in a group setting in the room, you can feel the energy of the people around mm-hmm. you, and something that you never would have noticed before. Even when I recently went on a walk with my dog, I was really excited to see this woman, and I said hi, and I was friendly, and her response was really different and unexpected. And so I asked around to see if everything was okay with her. And then I found out she had received some really bad news about her son. But I never would have known that if I didn't sense that energy. And that's why I do feel community is so important in reaching out to people and going to coffee or going for a walk in the mm-hmm. woods, or making sure that everyone puts on a brave face, and there's a story behind every smile. And that is so important, I think, especially with the peer pressure. It's hard to combat, mm-hmm. especially with the younger kids. So what do you say to these younger kids that are going to these parties, and and when they drink, they come out of their shell, or they're funnier or whatever, and they feel better about who they are? What do you say to that person?
Yeah, I think anytime that something besides yourself becomes a cornerstone to who you are, it's really dangerous, because whether that's alcohol or that's sports or that's your academics, anytime that becomes your identity. And I think that's hard, because as a young person, you're grasping at straws to try and figure out, who am I? Who do I want to be? And so you start collecting these activities or these endeavors, and so alcohol is a really easy one to reach to, or substances in general, right? Marijuana as well. Mm-hmm. I feel different. I feel more like myself. And what's tricky is, who is that? Who is yourself, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think it's really hard when you're in that identity struggle in those younger years to resist that urge to find yourself in something that is so feeble and has the potential for so much damage. I think about even, like I said, a neutral example of folks who their identity is bound up in their sports activities, and then they have that career-ending injury, right? And it ends their life in so many ways. And so that can be really challenging. And so, like I said, alcohol is an even more feeble kind of substitute for that, and it's a cruel mistress in many ways because of the outcomes long-term for a lot of folks. But I think in those situations, it's hard, right? Because as an adult, it's easy to look back and say, like, oh, of course, you just move through those situations differently and you make different choices. And in the moment with the peer pressure, it doesn't feel like that's an option. Mm-hmm. And so my feedback to adults and kids, youth the same, is you've got to find the people who support you being who you are. Mm-hmm. And if you're not a person who's extroverted and funny and crazy, and alcohol makes you that way, it's okay to not be that way, right?
Right.
It's okay to be different than your peers, because there's other peers like you, and maybe you're not finding them because you're looking for them at the extroverted parties, and they know they don't want to be there. And I think part of it is really trying to find your tribe. We talk about that a lot as adults too. Find your tribe. Who are the people who are in alignment with who you want to be? And in the recovery community, they talk about this. When they talk about finding a sponsor or finding a mentor, they say, find somebody who's got what you want. And I think that's so true as a young person, is find somebody who's got what you want, right? It might be peers who are the same age. It might be someone who's maybe a class or two above you. It might be teachers. It might be other adults in your community. But find people who have a life that you admire and that have a life that you want to live. And I think as you start to come into your own, you'll realize that those moments of peer pressure and those fleeting moments of maybe I fit in are not worth anything compared to that moment where you go, oh, I found my path. And alcohol is nobody's path, right?
No.
And so it's a superficial solution to just like a really profound struggle. And so I challenge people to go on the journey for that struggle, because it's so worth it when you get to a real outcome.
Mm-hmm. Can you tell us about a client success story? Obviously without names, but just...
Yeah, of course. I get surrounded by really great stories oftentimes. I'm profoundly grateful to get to work at an agency where we have people in their own recovery who share their story as part of their professional life. And I'm inspired by them every day. It's those moments where things feel like they're not looking up. And so we have alumni who are a part of our workforce at our agency now, which is really cool. Mm-hmm. And so they've reached that point where they've had sufficient sober time, they're pursuing school. And so there's one woman who stands out who I had the privilege of working with personally earlier on in my time at the agency. And she had been a person who had a lot of time sober, had worked in a treatment center at one point, and then things just started to slip for her. And she was an opiate user. And so she had gone back out and come back through the ringer repeatedly at this revolving door of treatment and relapse and treatment and relapse. And the last time that I worked with her, we had some really honest conversations about just the risk to her life. Obviously, there's a lot of discussion in the world about opiate overdoses. Those numbers have been staggering for the last several years. Mm-hmm. There's some promising statistics that maybe they've finally gone down this year for the first time since 2018. So we're waiting to see if it's been really impactful. And so we were having some honest conversations of, you never know if the next time you go out will be the last time that you go out. And she's like, I don't know why you're making me cry every time that we meet. And I was like, because I care about you and I want to see you be safe and successful. And she finished care successfully. She left, and probably about 9 months later, she returned to use again. And I was devastated because I got that news. And I was just so scared for her and just so worried. And what's really cool now is I ran into her. So she got sober again, and she's been sober since that point. So it's been, at this point, probably about 2 years. And I ran into her just out in the community. And so she reached out to me and said, oh my gosh, it was so great to see you. I just wanted to tell you that I'm getting my CADC, which is a certification to become a drug and alcohol counselor. I'm in school. I've got my daughter now. I'm in a great relationship. And at some point, maybe I'll be reaching out to be an intern so that way I can come back and serve in a community that means so much to me.
Wow.
And it's profound because I think there's some really nasty drugs out there. And so alcohol is one that we've accepted socially and said, oh, it's a poison, but we're okay with it in small quantities. But I think opiates are a really scary drug. And to have somebody who turns their life around from a drug that could have taken them out anytime that they used it because of what's out there, for her to be in a place where she's got a beautiful young daughter and a great relationship and she's following her career path in this way, it's really inspiring, I think.
Yeah, that is. I know so many college kids that went to college and had never done drugs and died because somebody convinced them to try this pot or somebody convinced them to take this little half hit of ecstasy or whatever. And they thought that what they told them it was, and they were gone. And the parents, family in disbelief. And that is such a common problem in our neighborhood.
Yeah.
And it just seems like the drugs have changed dramatically from when we were younger too. It's been really trying to emphasize to young people just to say no to all drugs, no matter what.
Yeah.
How do you feel about pot?
Yeah, so when you're a youth, it'll never happen to you. So I think that's a really hard conversation to have because that's a terrible story, but that won't happen to me. And that's the realm that I'm living in because of just how my brain's developing. But as far as pot, I think that's a really dangerous thing. I'm here in Illinois and marijuana is legal. Cannabis is legal. And we have dispensaries all over the place down the street from treatment centers, which feels like flagrant disrespect, but
totally.
it is. There's liquor stores down the street too. So I think one of the things that is challenging, and I say this often to clients, is that marijuana, I say this in a joking way, but like marijuana isn't your grandma's weed. Marijuana isn't what it was 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. There's so much synthetic material. There's so much lab grown whatever, and so there's a lot of risk. One, there's risk of, depending on where you're getting those drugs, risk of it being tainted with something else that could kill you, which is scary. But again, if I believe that would never happen to me, I'm like, oh, that poor sad sap, that's not going to be me though. But I think the other really scary thing that we're seeing is because of the potency of the marijuana that's out there now, we're seeing research coming out speaking about the impacts on young brains. We're seeing an increase in psychosis and schizophrenia and schizoaffective disorder and these really significant life-changing diagnoses. And they're attributing a lot of that to people's heavy cannabis use. because of the way it's altering the brain. And what would have been, hey, sometimes I get this hallucinogen effect from using marijuana, but then it goes away. What we're finding is that it's triggering this early onset, more permanent set of symptoms for people. And we're seeing this in treatment anecdotally here as well. I can tell you that the number of young people in care under the age of 25 whose primary drug of choice is cannabis and who are experiencing active psychosis right now is profound, and is not what we saw 5 years ago.
Wow.
And so I think it's really important for kids to know that everyone just jokes, oh, it's just a little weed, right? It was just a little weed maybe 30 years ago, but it's changed so much that the long-term impacts are really, really huge. And like I said, life-altering, because trying to move through the world with a diagnosis of schizophrenia or schizoaffective disorder or delusions in general, it makes daily life really difficult. And so it's not impossible to live that way. There's lots of people who, with lots of treatment and support, are able to be successful, but it's a lot harder of a road than not dabbling with cannabis and potentially putting yourself in a spot like that.
It even smells differently. And I also noticed just over the years, when I really never had an opinion either way about pot, but what I did notice is every single person that did smoke a lot of pot were just unmotivated. They had that common denominator. So I definitely thought it had some sort of influence on that. But that's really interesting. I didn't realize like those side effects were now being seen. Wow. I would imagine that a lot of people think alcohol helps in business relationships, but I've had a lot of friends that are financially successful, and they were once alcoholics. And when the family got together and finally got them to give up drinking, that's when they saw this huge success and happiness for them.
Yeah.
Do you hear that a lot?
Yeah, I think that there's just all these tropes, these stereotypes that the successful business people all go out for drinks afterwards and they wine and dine each other. And sure, there is that, but I think there's a lot of seedy things that happen in some of those endeavors as well, right? Because you've got people with lowered inhibitions who are making maybe less considerate or ethical decisions. And so that might be about business dealings. The amount of like sexual harassment cases that come up from the workplace around drinking engagements is huge. And so I think there's a lot of risk there, and a lot of risk to somebody who wants to be a successful person in their line of work because of some of those factors, because of alcohol. But our agency, what I love about it is that we were founded by folks who are all in their own recovery, and our ownership group all the way through a bunch of our top leaders in our company are sober. And it's great to be able to go out and not have to worry about that. I think what was impactful for me, we went on a business trip earlier this year, and we went to this great restaurant, and they start rattling off all of their best in-house beverages and whiskeys, and we're all sitting there just chuckling to ourselves because he's going. And finally, the president of the company is like, none of us are drinking. At that point, I was very pregnant as well, and so you couldn't tell. At least one of us wasn't, but all of us are not drinking. And they were like, oh, we have this great menu full of sober mocktails. And we're like, cool, we'll get around to those. I think the sober curious movement for this, but it was neat to know that a very fine dining restaurant that had this exclusive room full of their own whiskeys also was like, oh, we have a mocktails list. And that's not just for 12-year-old kids anymore.
Right.
There's plenty of adult people. And so you could be here on business, being a successful person, eating at a fine dining place, and still get a mocktail, and it's not the same as a Shirley Temple when you were a kid.
Right.
And you see what happens in those business dealings is you've got people who have clarity, who have their life in their own control, right? I'm not, shackled to anything else, and I don't feel like I need to lower my inhibitions to have this conversation. I don't feel like I need to grease the wheels and get you in a position where you might be more responsive to me. I believe that I have the wherewithal to have this productive conversation and make things happen sober. And I think that there's a lot of power that comes from that. in a world that hasn't always prioritized that in business dealings.
Mm-hmm. And I know there are a number of companies that in the interviewing process will feed you alcohol to see what kind of fool you make of yourself. So there's that people are unaware of, but it is a test.
Oh, it's profound. And I think you see it too a lot with grad schools, right? I got my doctorate in social work, and so it was a little bit different. I didn't get wooed as much as maybe a PhD candidate for engineering and whatnot, but some of those cultures around graduate school are very drinking heavy. There was some recent research that got pushed my way about how IQ in high school was correlated with higher prevalence of drinking later in life. Mm-hmm. And I highly suspect that it's because those folks with those higher IQs in high school are likely to go on into these environments that are centered around alcohol use and substance use, like college, grad school, these careers that really push alcohol use. And it doesn't surprise me at all that your folks who are doing really well in high school then go on to become problem drinkers, because they are in these environments over and over again where that's the norm, that's the cultural expectation of that place. And I think it's important for students to think about as they're planning for college, as they're thinking about what they want to do, is to be aware of that, because it's a really slippery slope.
Yeah, I had a friend in high school who was very intelligent, and she was really sweet, and she never drank in high school, and then she got to college, a big party school, and it took her, I think, 12 years to graduate because she got so caught up in the alcohol and drug scene, and it just was so out of character for her. You just would have expected her to say no throughout her whole life because she had that kind of strong conviction. So it can happen to anyone.
Yeah, and I think that's the danger of that experimentation is the first time that I do something, I get the best euphoric experience that I'm ever going to get with that drug. But then we talk about it a lot in the substance use field, that then I'm chasing that high, and I convince myself that it'll be that way if I continue to use, but my tolerance is changing, so now I have to use more, and then it comes to the point that I'm using just to stave off withdrawals. And like I said, this mistress that was like, oh, this great romance where this substance gave me all of these great feelings and this great experience and whatever, I'm trying to replicate it, and I never will, and it'll always fall short, and it'll always require more of me to try to make it happen. And I think that's the trap that people get stuck in.
Is there anything else that you'd like our listeners to know that I haven't covered?
I think that the most important, if you're examining your relationship with substances right now, if you're considering like, oh, there's dry January coming up, but it's also the holidays, and you're dabbling with the thought, try it. Because I say often to people who come into treatment, they'll say, I don't have a problem with X substance, right? I don't have a problem with alcohol. I only have a problem with weed, right? And I'll say, cool, if you don't have a problem with alcohol, then it shouldn't be a problem to stop alcohol for 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, because you don't have a problem with it. And if you find that maybe you have more of a problem than you thought when you engage in that experiment, that's an important moment for you of reflection of, do I want to live shackled to this, where this is dictating any part of my life? And so, and of course, like there are people who are normal drinkers and their alcohol use is very moderated and very rare, and it's really just an adjunct or a supplement to these particular moments in life. But if you're a person who's considering or dabbling with, I encourage you to embark on the experiment, because you might find some really interesting things about yourself. And you might also find that maybe you don't recognize your drinking as a problem, but you might find that when you stop drinking, your clarity improves, your sleep improves, your immune system improves, and you say, you know what, the trade-off of this to that, I'm going to opt for the mocktails from here on out. And so I just encourage anybody who's considering it to like take that leap and to experiment with it, and you might be surprised what you find.
I agree. Thank you so much for all this information. I've learned so much. And is there a way people can get in touch with you or learn more about your organization? Would you mind sharing that?
Absolutely. So our agency is Northern Illinois Recovery Center, and through the magic of Google, it's pretty easy to track us down that way, but it's northernillinoisrecovery.com. And then I am happy to take anybody who wants to reach out. I love to answer questions and support people and help them find resources in their communities as well. And so I'm available by email pretty easily, pretty regularly. And so I encourage anybody who might want to reach out or has questions or wants to run something past somebody. My email address is cmcclure, so my first initial last name, and then at northernillinoisrecovery.com.
Thank you so much, and I really appreciate all your time.
Thank you so much, Mary Kay.
Please find a really comfortable seat. You can be in a chair, laying on your back, outside, wherever you feel comfortable. And just relax the muscles in your face. Take a deep breath in, inhaling for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Hold the breath. And now I want you to exhale with your mouth open as if you're fogging a mirror. And breathe in. Hold the breath and a long exhale. Just start to slow down the mind. You'll notice thoughts popping in and out. And just focus on either the breath or one word. It could be peace. When we allow ourselves to focus on the breath or a mantra, you are fully present. You can't obsess about the past or worry about the future. You are in the moment. And when we're in the moment, we can experience what we're doing while we're doing it and really feel present. Release the judgment that you have for yourself and others. We're so quick to see the way someone dresses and determine whether we would be friends with them or not. Release that need to label. Release envy, anger, sadness. Let it leave the body. As you inhale, I want you to fill your body up with all that beautiful energy all around you. Wherever you are, listen to the layers of sound. Might be a sound outside, my voice, any extraneous noises. Just start to notice your surroundings. Unclench your teeth, relax your jaw. Soften your eyes. Your eyes will roll back in your head. Let your lips part. And the breath starts to slow down. And now relax your shoulders and your neck, your upper back, lower back. Start to scan the body. And then squeeze your fists together, really tight squeeze. And now open your hands wide. And squeeze your fists together and open your hands wide. Now relax your arms and your hands. Let your hips feel loose and heavy and your legs relax down to the feet. Your feet are carrying you everywhere all day. And just express gratitude to your feet. And to your strong, remarkable body that you want to nurture and feed with healthy farm-to-table foods and healthy drinks like water, grapefruit juice, orange juice, lemon juice. Nurture your soul and feel the goodness that's being nurtured into your body. Your body is a temple, and it affects not only you, but everyone around you. You are a remarkable being with lots of talents, some undiscovered, And you owe it to the world to share these talents with a sound mind, healthy mindset, and your beautiful energy. The world deserves to experience your individual, unique, beautiful energy and all its potential. Thank you for joining us today. Namaste.